Welcome! In this lecture, we will discuss social welfare policy. Many of us are drawn to social work because we want to work directly with underserved or underrepresented individuals, families, or communities. We may not have thought as much about the role that policy plays in our profession or how it impacts the populations we want to serve. In this lecture, we will begin to uncover the importance of understanding social welfare policy and its relationship to the social work profession. First, let's take a minute to review what we mean by the term social welfare. Social welfare refers to public or private institutions in modern industrial societies that promote the well-being of a community or a society. We also want to remember that social welfare is influenced by and also reflects the ways in which, as a society, we have framed our priorities in terms of both identifying social problems as well as addressing those problems via social welfare programs or services. Also, we need to consider the way that society has viewed individual and social responsibility. So how much societal support should there be for addressing these problems, or how much responsibility should the individual have for meeting their own needs? We also need to consider views of human nature and human need. For example, how are we defining need in a society? Finally, we want to think about views on the nature of change and how those views also impact social welfare. Now we want to move on to thinking about social welfare in the policy context. So just a little review. Policy in general is a guide or plan for decision making. You've probably often heard the term public policy, and that refers to any action taken by government. And it's the term we generally use to talk about decisions, laws, or regulations that are put forth by the government or governing bodies. Finally, let's go a little bit farther or distill a little bit more to social welfare policy. Social welfare policy speaks to specific action taken by the government that deals with benefits to vulnerable populations and or universal services. So when we talked about what social welfare was, it's programs, services, institutions that deal with and support well-being. And so you can see this connection that social welfare policy is also addressing those needs via the implementation of programs and services that will provide direct benefit. When we think about social welfare policy, we want to be mindful of the fact that it's actually creating frameworks and structures that inform, limit, or advance our social work practice and has implications for our professional goal of social justice. We also want to think about the characteristics of policy and how these characteristics of policy play into the responses that we see and ways that we engage with policy as social workers. So first of all, policies are socially constructed. So the policy responses and the social problems that they address have been created by human beings, typically in past generations, but they continue to be held in place by our consent and our failure to act to change them. We often also refer to or think of social problems and policy responses as being reified. And what that means is that we're treating them as though they exist outside of human creation, that they seem necessary and inevitable, almost like a biological imperative. A good example of this would be poverty. The idea is that poverty is a, inevitable part of the social condition, that there will be always some with less and others with more. But is that really the case? And can we actually utilize policy initiatives to eradicate poverty? Because it doesn't exist outside of human creation. And so taking this to the next step, it's important to remember that despite these policy characteristics, we can make change. And so as social workers, we need to be aware of biases and values that are entrenched in policy and also be prepared to challenge them. We want to be able to develop a critical consciousness which reinforces our professional responsibility to advocate by transforming social policies that are unjust. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this lecture. So as we've been mentioning throughout this presentation, as social workers, our professional mission is to work toward creating a socially just society. And one way we can do that is work toward that is by challenging social welfare policy that results in injustice and advocating for policy that promotes social justice. I want to just take one step back and review what we mean when we're talking about social justice. Social justice refers to an equitable distribution of resources that enable all members of society to be psychologically and physically safe and secure. A society where individuals, families, and groups or communities are able to achieve a balance of self-determination and interdependence. So thinking about that definition of social justice and our professional mission, let's talk a little bit about the connection between social work and social welfare policy. So as has been noted, policy is an important component of social work practice. There's actually power to make change via social welfare policy, and we as social workers are very well positioned to facilitate this change. It's also important that we remember that our social work practice and social welfare policy have a reciprocal relationship. This means that practice affects policy and policy affects practice. Given our direct contact with client populations that are impacted by social welfare policy, social workers have a very unique perspective. So when we as social workers are serving individuals, families, groups, and communities, we have an opportunity to see the impact that these policies are having and whether these impacts are positive or negative, and then decide whether there's a need to advocate for change. And in fact, advocacy is a very important part of our work and has been part of our professional mission since the late 1800s. The Encyclopedia of Social Work defines social work advocacy as the exclusive and mutual representation of clients or causes in a forum attempting to systematically influence decision-making in an unjust or unresponsive system. In order for us to be successful advocates, social workers must be aware of these policies that are impacting or could potentially impact the populations that we work with. We also need to be ready to garner public support for issues and needs that are impacting marginalized, underrepresented populations we serve. I just also want to make a note that as social workers, we are often seen as experts on social welfare policy and can be invited to testify before Congress or state and local government as experts in order to justify the need for a policy or to communicate the impact of a policy. So now we've talked a little bit about some of the key definitions in terms of social welfare and policy, as well as the connection between social work and social welfare policy. Now we're going to take a minute to talk about the policy and environment perspective and dig a little bit more deeply into some of the ways in which values and framing from a historical perspective in society have an impact on social welfare policy development. So just as we use the person and environment framework to inform our understanding of individual behavior, it is important that we as social workers think about viewing policy within a policy and environment framework. This means that in order for us to really understand social welfare policy, we need to consider historical societal values as well as political and economic forces that exist. In the United States particularly, it is imperative that we consider the legacy of discrimination in our society and how that has impacted and informed social welfare policy responses. In the United States, social welfare policies have typically maintained the status quo rather than creating broad structural or institutional change. This relates to dominant conservative ideologies in our country. Conservative in this context does not refer to a political party, but rather the desire to uphold traditional attitudes and values while being cautious about change or innovation. These conservative ideologies are often passed down across generations without question or verification, and therefore are shared by large numbers of people in society who have the power to define our reality. As you can imagine, this makes sweeping change hard to accomplish from the policy perspective. Now, we've touched on the potential importance that historical values can have in shaping and informing social welfare policy. We're going to take a minute to talk more about some of these dominant historical values and the way in which they've interacted with social welfare policy. Historical values in the United States that have informed social problem identification and subsequent social welfare policy action or inaction relate to two core themes. One, an emphasis on the individual, and two, an emphasis on work. In the U.S., the idea of personal responsibility, conveyed through individualism, independence, and self-reliance, is a core value. This has led to many, especially those with power and privilege, to assert that individuals should be able to meet their own needs and that seeking help from social welfare programs is an individual deficit or weakness. Therefore, from this perspective, there isn't a lot of support for government intervention in addressing the needs of individuals in our society and creating systems and structures to provide social welfare services. Additionally, there is extremely high value placed on work in the United States. This has led to the false narrative that if individuals work hard enough, they will achieve material success in our society. Therefore, if someone is in need of assistance, this value has led many to assert that that person just needs to work harder. This also contributes to the false idea of equal opportunity and an equal playing field for those who work hard enough. This value does not acknowledge the structural inequality that exists in the United States. Now we're going to move on to just some summary of how these historical values interact with privilege and impact social welfare policy. So as we talked about, the dominant values or these more conservative ideologies are disseminated across generations, but they're also disseminated through social welfare policy. And what that does ultimately is allow those in power to maintain their power and privileged status. Those who hold the power are able to control the narrative around these dominant values and subsequently control social welfare policy responses. Therefore, in the United States, social welfare policy has usually maintained the status quo. It is also of note that in the U.S., there is not a strong radical political tradition to critique or challenge the status quo or propose socially just alternatives. And when we're talking about political radicalism or this radical tradition, what we're really focused on is political principles that aim to alter social structures through revolutionary means and changing value systems in fundamental ways. In the U.S., we have had an incremental approach in which small changes are made to our existing systems and social structures rather than more broad, sweeping, revolutionary change that would completely shift the way that we are thinking about issues and designing our social structures to address need in our society. Now, we want to take a moment to review some recurring themes in social welfare policy that you'll be hearing again and again over time in this course. One is universality versus selectivity. So in social welfare policy, you'll see kind of two branches. One where everyone in society is eligible for benefits, that's the universality, and another where those who receive benefits must meet some type of eligibility criteria, which is typically needs-based. That's selectivity. Often, you'll see that universality and selectivity map onto the second theme we're going to be talking about, which is social insurance versus public assistance. And so when we're talking about social insurance programs, these are typically programs that are more broad in scope, that folks are paying into and then receiving a benefit, while the public assistance programs are more of those selectivity-based programs where you're receiving benefits based on your need. Again, we'll see another theme that talks about deserving versus undeserving poor. And throughout history in the United States, there has been this sort of false dichotomy in which individuals in need have been viewed as either being deserving of that need or undeserving of that need. And that has impacted the way that we have structured social welfare policy and provided need in our country. Finally, you'll be hearing a lot about social welfare policy and social control. And what this means is whether social welfare policy is in fact primarily aimed at meeting the needs of individuals in our society and supporting their self-sufficiency, or whether there are aspects of control embedded within these policies in which individuals are expected to meet certain expectations and guidelines in order to receive benefits. Again, be listening for these themes as you continue on with the course. They are really central to discussions of social welfare policy. Finally, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the challenges and opportunities when we're thinking about how to move towards social justice within the social welfare policy context. You can see that some of the challenges are presented here: complex systems, multiple goals, and conflicting perspectives or interests of parties involved. However, all of these challenges actually represent opportunities for us as social workers to become engaged in social welfare policy and really advocate for policies that are going to be socially just. In part, we are trained to be able to understand the ways in which micro, meso, and macro systems are connected, and so we have a unique perspective in that sense, in which we can understand complex systems and engage in these discussions around policy within that context in a very informed way. We're also trained to think a lot about the best ways to engage folks in dialogue and to have challenging conversations. So even if we're not agreeing on something, be able to open up that opportunity to engage and try to work together to, of course, advocate for the interests of our clients and get those voices to the table, but also begin to think of ways that we can really work together to build coalitions and organize around issues of importance as well. Thank you for listening today. I hope that you have an overview of social welfare policy and the importance of it in the social work profession.